game hunter is stranded on an island where he ends up as the prey. That's basically, of course, the story of the most dangerous game. And the original being done in 1932, and the remake most recently in 2020 on the channel formerly known as Quibi and stuff. I'm John Sang with Dan Edmonds.
Hi there.
And yeah, I think maybe like an interesting question this time around is, what are your thoughts about survival kind of situation, and what do you figure your chances are of like kind of making it in the real life hunt?
Well, the funny thing is, my life has been in danger several times through various mishaps, and I've managed to pull through quite a few times. So I've managed to fall off a cliff. I've contracted malaria. I'm trying to think. There's probably a few others as well. I think I've been in a crash and accident as well. So each time I've made it through. So I'm pretty confident somehow I'd be okay.
For me, like the closest thing I came to that was the survival week training that between the ground school portion and the actual flight training in back in the Navy and stuff. And I can tell you that I managed to kind of make it through the week with eating minimal kind of amount of grub, but the minute the bus kind of unleashes back in the world, I made a beeline for McDonald's.
Yeah,
that's the extent of my survival training stuff.
I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, it's when you're in a desperate situation, it's amazing how your appreciation for food becomes pretty paramount, we'll say.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Definitely, like one thing I realized was it gets to a certain point where you've got to decide, like how many calories am I going to expend getting this thing, and then how many calories will it return in terms of that in my body that'll keep me going and stuff like that. And it's an interesting calculus to face.
Absolutely. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of having machine gun pointed at your head, that's certainly a great experience for reprioritizing things in your life.
Yes.
And that pair of sneakers, not so important really. So yeah, anyway, stories for another time, I guess, perhaps. But the most dangerous game.
Yeah, so it's based on this short story by this Richard Connell stuff, written in 1924 and stuff. And it's interesting that the movie itself was shot in the evenings on the same sets, basically the jungle sets for King Kong. I mean, I think that's kind of fascinating, and it's like the Hollywood equivalent of multitasking, I guess.
Yeah, well, it certainly saves them some money. But I mean, also it's interesting because they're both very similar kind of premises as well, in that you've got desperate people who've inadvertently ended up on an island who are being hunted and or are hunting something else, that is either in theory more primitive or more sophisticated than them, depending on how you want to view each interpretation, really.
Yeah, and it also kind of made Fay Wray quite kind of the jungle scream queen.
I'm sure, right.
She really kind of I think got lots of training in that. She's perfecting her horror, I guess.
Well, I think what's interesting about this, because I was trying to look at, what was any kind of historical context for this. And I thought, maybe this was related to the Depression or maybe, competitive natures and things like this. But, the story was written in 1924. So this was way before any of that. And but I read that hunting and safaris in general were pretty popular in the 20s. And it was like the wealthy people's things to do. And I mean, you've got to understand that I guess people had the ability to travel more easily and could go across and go big tiger hunting in some sort of far off place. So obviously this is just art imitating life, so to speak.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that in King Kong, that like there was this fascination with like kind of these jungle travel kind of things and stuff. I think I might have mentioned when we talked about that about Ripley and how he really built a platform on that. Kind of like the whole believe it or not. Granted, there was quite a bit of the curiosities and curios and stuff like that, but a lot of the stories were related to jungle adventures and like kind of finding headhunters and kind of bizarre kind of shrinking, kind of, things that like, people never really heard of before that.
Yeah, I mean, there is this odd sort of, and you see this all throughout the other movies and other things that were going on at the time, in that you had Animal Crackers, which was a Marx Brothers movie, and
Right.
there's various other things, like they had what they called the Barkies. So once speaking films were invented, they had recreations of famous films with dogs dressed up in various outfits, and that was a whole thing in the 20s. It was, I mean, it's pretty hilarious, but and I have to say, what I realized is that this being a pre-code movie in Hollywood, pre-code movies are actually really entertaining from what I can tell. All the ones I've seen, I've really enjoyed. And it makes you realize just how constrained movies became after they did introduce those sort of codes. So I would almost be happy to do a series of originals versus remakes for pre-code movies to whatever came after them. But
there's probably more than one and stuff like that. And then, and I feel like it also like kind of led into this thing that we've again mentioned about the Scotty Bowers kind of things where like there's the pre-code behavior and like kind of what was allowed, kind of almost anything was allowed, and then afterwards like kind of it's almost like kind of all of a sudden everybody had this Puritan kind of image and stuff like that, and it's all about image and all about and stuff that we kind of touched upon with The Star Is Born and stuff like that, where like there's a lot of things that like were still happening, but then it became hush hush and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Star Is Born is a very good sort of comment on that, probably that shift that happened in Hollywood. I mean, and the way you can tell this is a pre-code movie because there's shrunken heads displayed in jars. There's people stabbing dogs and things like this. It's just wouldn't get that in the late 30s or 40s. So yeah.
So we have this character. Basically Joel McCrea plays the Bob Rainsford character, stuff like that. He's the big game hunter that's supposedly kind of world renowned, stuff like that. Gets stranded on this island and everything, and then Lizzie Banks plays this Count Zaroff that basically kind of present him with the rules of the game and stuff like that, and kind of more or less begins. I mean, Fay Wray's kind of in this, but she's a relatively minor character, stuff like that. She kind of basically ends up on the island as well. And, what's called I guess I feel like it almost like kind of she's wedged into the story because it's she's not in the original short story, but she's kind of just wedged in, just kind of like almost like a obligatory love interest / raising the stakes kind of thing.
Yeah, getting some female audience vaguely invested in the story.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, it moves very quickly. I have to say this movie is barely over an hour.
Yeah.
So it really makes you realize just how much time gets wasted. I mean, the first 8 minutes of this movie is like the first hour of Peter Jackson's King Kong. It's like they get everything done in 8 minutes. It's incredible. So, but I mean, it's this thing where there's a really interesting conversation when he first arrives there, where they're actually kind of discussing what is the actual appeal of going out and hunting animals. Is it this desire to think that you're superior, or is this really a product of us being more sophisticated and more civilized? Are we more evolved if we just go and hunt animals? Likewise, what would it be to be on the receiving end? So I kind of feel this was I mean, we've had obviously the theory of evolution had been around for a good 80 odd years at that point, 70 or 80 years, I suppose. And this almost feels like I guess that one of the first talking movies that kind of explores anything in those kind of areas, this idea of, what is man's place in society and what makes acceptable behavior for a competitive or someone who excels, or what actually constitutes a psychopath basically in society. So yeah
we'll definitely kind of dive more into the psychopath aspect of stuff. I think what's interesting about what you just said too is like kind of probably like another interesting connection too with King Kong is this idea of like what does civilized really mean and stuff like that, versus like kind of like the primitive and like kind of where and like even though that like it's less of a race thing and stuff like that, but it's still, I think, in some ways like this. I guess it's probably, if anything, more about like class and stuff like that too, where like if you're wealthy enough, you can kind of go on these safaris and go hunting and stuff like that. And it's probably less like we'll see in the 2020, where like it makes it more apparent that like if you're rich, then kind of you can have at it, and like kind of like the rules of society don't really apply to you and stuff like that. But it is still like this idea though that like kind of we're hunters, like kind of like that. And so to me, it's like almost like we're it's justifying that like if you're wealthy, then like the world's there, not only your oyster, but also like your hunting ground and stuff like that.
No, I mean, Baron Zaroff is portrayed in that way. I mean, he's the sort of Tsarist Russian elite who's
White Russian
escaped. Yeah,
he's specifically called.
Yeah, and he's escaped from the revolution and has gone and sort of set up camp with all of his money on this island. Although that's also quite how you would actually survive long term like that. I don't know. That doesn't really seem to make sense. But anyway, it works for the movie. I mean, for me, just the sheer number of dogs he has. Like, how would you maintain and keep all those dogs?
Right.
Where would all the pet food come from? But yeah. So anyway,
they're dead people.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, there's the part of that conversation is this idea that where one of them argues that when he's hunting a tiger, the tiger is the willing participant in the hunt because he tries to attack back, which of course is probably not the case. The tiger is trying to defend itself. So,
right.
But it's interesting that they have this as a way of this sort of delusional justification of what you're doing is kind of in actually the hero who makes that argument on the boat before they actually arrive on the island, which I thought was interesting.
Right.
But yeah, I kind of see it as a statement on, I guess, kind of competitive behavior in a way. There's lots of things in that, and because it's always about like who's the best hunter, who's going to be like the alpha dog, so to speak. So yeah, that was kind of interesting.
And it's funny how like the basic idea of the movie is like this idea that like tigers and lions or elephants, whatever, like kind of quote unquote are not challenged enough and stuff, and so the only real challenge is another human being and everything. That has, I guess, its wits about it and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, I think that's a interesting kind of idea too about like that. I don't know, like this thing of where another human being is the only thing that's kind of smart enough or kind of that can be creative enough to create or to pose a challenge, because anything else like kind of a tiger or lion, stuff like that. Physically stronger, but it's just intellectually it's not really that much of a challenge to himself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's also interesting is the way this and a lot of these, and we'll touch on this I guess later on, is how this has influenced many other movies of its type. And there's always this kind of, what I like in this is kind of a movie of three parts, in that there's the being stranded and the charming host, where there's often like this this decadence, i.e. he's living this lavish lifestyle and people get sort of drawn into this kind of decadence. Then there's a moment of horror where they realize what's actually going on. And in this one, that's actually probably the most effective part of this entire movie, is the horror of them discovering his trophy room. And then there's the kind of the action sequence after that. So in that, it's a really well-paced movie. There's suspense, and then this kind of horror element, and then this kind of action element towards the end. But there's often this idea of decadence and inequality is a common theme in all of these sort of things. Like The Hunger Games is a very similar kind of premise.
Yes.
A less obvious one would be The Black Hole by Disney, which is similar in that it has people stranded in space. There's a sort of lavish kind of thing where, again, you've got a foreign guy who's kind of who then ends up kind of hunting them to turn them into kind of cyborgs. So it's an oddly, because I've always wondered what it feels so different from so many other sci-fi movies of that era. And then it just kind of clicked as we were talking about this, what that's really drawing from.
It's funny you say that too. The way you described that too really reminded me of this character called the Governor in The Walking Dead. I forget what season and stuff, but and it was just pretty much that same setup. And now I can definitely see the influence there. That, like, basically, like you said, it's this kind of lavish lifestyle, like where here the Rick and his gang are like kind of surviving, struggling in the wild and stuff, and they come across this civilization that's kind of in these walled gates and stuff like that. And there's this promise of like, oh, if you just become part of us, then you too can live this kind of nice lifestyle. But meanwhile, kind of what's really hidden is the fact that, like, this dude is like kind of like what's called intentionally turning people into undead, kind of again, make just spoilers, stuff like that.
I haven't watched that, so there we go. But yeah.
But yeah, he's like, this kind of sophisticated, he has the title of the Governor or something like that. He's charming until, of course, like kind of the gang decides not to go with him and stuff like that. Then and I guess that's a similar kind of setup too, where like, once what's called Rainsford doesn't quite, I mean, he's not, even though he's like kind of agreeing in some degrees with Zaroff and stuff, but then he's really like kind of just trying to refuse, trying to not, trying to call it like crazy and stuff like that. But in the end, he gets sucked into the game to basically, it's for his life, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the different characters are all kind of looking at this in different ways. The Fay Wray character is just like, she obviously doesn't trust anything because she's sort of seeing through that and looking what's actually happening, whereas her brother is just enjoying all the alcohol and kind of like lamenting the 20s, it seems, because he's like, oh, things aren't so good everywhere these days, and he's, so there's this idea of you can't trust, behind every kind of charming exterior there hides a sinister kind of path that's led them to this lavish lifestyle, which is a trope that has been used many, many, many times in movies. So.
And that's an interesting commentary right there too. Like, I didn't think about that. That, like, I mean, this is Prohibition. Like, so like the thing that like this count kind of has generously offered and also has apparently plenty of is this thing that's illegal, like kind of back home and stuff like that for these guys.
Very true. I hadn't thought of that at all, that this is, he's offering some kind of forbidden fruit almost
right
for them as well, which would have been the case at the time. No, I think it's I mean, it must have been one of the first that even kind of explored this idea, and it's even now, I mean, it's a very effective movie. I think, as I say, for me the most powerful thing is that this sort of shock when they actually find their way into the trophy room, and even though obviously the shrunken heads don't look particularly scary by today's standards, but it's still a very powerful sort of moment, I think, for the movie. I mean, there's other things like, I mean, when the guys get attacked by the shark, one of them, the exact line, if I can find it, I've got it in my notes here, was like, "Oh, he got me." I think if a shark has bitten off your leg, "Ooh, he got me," it's probably going to be like the last thing that comes out. But whatever. I mean, people didn't know at the time. So it's obviously not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but still a good watch, really, I thought, all in all.
And definitely, of course, we're talking about the 2020 as kind of the remake we'll be looking at. This is probably the most literal one, but like there's definitely been many over the years. One that's kind of like we won't be necessarily looking at that is kind of really funny. Is another Roger Corman exploitation movie called The Woman Hunt and stuff. So it's kind of like very much very exploitive. Translation, but at some point we'll be looking at unofficial ones that are, I think, really worth looking at. Is Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and The Hunt, which was actually roughly the same timing as the one we'll be looking at today, but it's a lot more political, a lot more on the nose about its subject matter and stuff.
Yeah, it's when you see a few of these, or you realize just how similar they are in content. We could do the Hunger Games as well, although I think that's slightly different in
Well, we'll be looking at it as like kind of the more that one mirroring the Japanese movie that
Battle Royale.
Battle Royale, yeah.
Oh, or Death Race, you know. It's very similar kind of thing. I mean, you could say Death Race to some degree steals a bit from this as well, but it's a very different kind of. Yeah, it's different enough. I would say Hunger Games more copies Death Race than it does an out-and-out Dangerous Game copy.
I think to me, like one of the key elements of this story is the jungle and stuff, and surviving by your wits and stuff. And so yeah, let's dive into the 2020 version, because it's instead of a literal jungle, it's a concrete jungle and stuff. Here we have Liam Hemsworth as Dodge Tynes, a very kind of adventure kind of sounding name, as the prey. And the organizer this time is Christoph Waltz, who's kind of like apparently representing these well-to-do hunters and everything. And at stake, kind of the love interest is this kind of wife, Val, played by Sarah Gadon, who actually I kind of thought I recognized her and didn't realize that she's been quite a few things over the years. And so the one that kind of I think I'm trying to think of the thing that stands out. There's something that the Stephen King adaptation with the adaptation of the Stephen King novel 11/22/63 as the alternate history, with like trying to stop the JFK assassination stuff, and she's the love interest in that, and that was really great kind of performance / series and stuff. So I really recommend it. No remake of that one yet.
No, I didn't even realize that was Stephen King actually until. But yeah, and I mean, similar premise, desperate person. Confronted by a charming erudite person offering them a decadent lifestyle, and in this time it's a chance to win big, but because he's a bit more worthy, he's protecting his family.
Right.
But much like The Stand, almost from the gate, anything modern must for some reason have vomiting in it. It's like whatever TV shows, there's always like, what is this thing with like every episode has to have some vomiting? But anyway, they didn't do it too much in this, but anyway. Yeah, and there's a lot of exposition, I would say. I pretty much skipped over most of episode 2 because it was so predictable, just the same old kind of stuff. He's the loving father, he gets cancer and blah, blah, blah. I just, you can pretty much fast forward to mid episode 3. Where it actually gets interesting when they start talking about the rules of the game and what he's got to do.
Yeah, I think we should mention though that even though it's 15 episodes, it seems like a lot, but these are like 7-8 minutes, like kind of average runtime and stuff of each episode, because it was developed for Quibi, which was like supposed to be this mobile distribution where basically you're watching short form content on your mobile phone, stuff like that. And it debuted, April 2020. And unfortunately, by then, the world had shut down and people weren't traveling around much interested in kind of watching something on their mobile phone and stuff.
Well, I think we discussed this previously about what is the actual format of movie and film and TV? Because, we've gone from this idea that you can only jam pack so many surprises and twists into a 2-hour window. So this is why TV's become more popular. It gives you that extension of which to play with. But the idea of taking longer form, more complicated narrative and then breaking it up into lots of chunks, it seems like it seemed to me like a bad idea, because what they're doing is they're looking at YouTube and saying, they're doing everything in 10 minutes because that's what people's attention span is. We'll just take a TV show and break it up. But all you're doing is you're reintroducing the advert break, which people have got tired of over, the last 20 years. We don't need that anymore. That was a very odd decision to go with that. But because the difference is YouTube has videos that are 10 minutes, but that's because the content begins and ends within a 10-minute window. So, strange decision.
And for me, usually when I'm on YouTube, I'm either browsing, and so I'm, if it's something I'm really interested, I might spend more than a few minutes watching it. But otherwise, I'm searching for something, so I'm looking up an item or how to, put memory into my, or replace the memory in my computer or something like that, and like,
Yeah.
and then I'm really watching it for those few minutes to kind of like tell me what's like kind of the trick to doing that, or like other times again like kind of it's pretty much what's it's kind of suggesting as based on my behavior with like kind of a certain account and whatever, because I do have like different accounts and some of which are like kind of like my interest in food and like go into in depth about how to cook this particular noodle dish and stuff like that, and then so just keep serving up kind of other noodle dishes or other kind of similar kind of what's called if not noodle dishes, they'll be like kind of rice dishes and stuff.
Absolutely. Or sometimes I'm just looking for an off-the-cuff discussion of a pre-code movie remake,
Right.
For like an hour or so. Yeah. So, so the acting, I thought it was generally quite bad in this, and except for Christoph Waltz, obviously. Liam Hemsworth, I don't know, he doesn't even run convincingly like an athlete in this. So it was, I mean, it was all right, I suppose. The bad guys, it's a camp English bad guy who's seems like he's constipated and sniffs a lot. What is all that about? Yeah, just bad. And then it was like a cavalcade of bad accents from the bad guys. In that you had Reagan, who was some sort of person who clearly isn't from the deep south, from some crocodile hunting sort of Mississippi murky water. It's just ridiculous. And you got a kung fu Asian lady, so that's
right.
And and the Nigerian killer was, he wasn't bad actually. He was okay, I suppose, but it was still pretty.
He's probably the most menacing out of the bunch, though. So
yeah, I suppose so. But also incredibly unbelievable in that he knew exactly which church this guy was going to turn up with, managed to find a priest's outfit, change in time to make sure he was sat in the confessional booth by the like, what? Come on. Yeah. So that was kind of disappointing, but still it was, you got to remember this is basically like one long chase sequence. So it's not hard to watch, there's plenty of stuff to keep you engaged, but it's not particularly realistic or believable in any way, shape or form. You've got the brother from Diary, I will say, of a Wimpy Kid as the kind of the tech IT guy for the elite hunting corporation. And it made me wonder, like, who are these? They seem to have a whole team full of millennials who are obviously willing, say, okay, yeah, we're just going to go and do like IT support for, murdering psychopaths.
Hey, times are hard,
Times are hard,
You got to take the gigs that you can get.
Maybe I get Google or Facebook after this, but I'm just gonna deal with like viciously murdering people and tracking them for a while. So that was a bit strange. Yeah, and I think what was interesting for me in a more kind of, I guess, thematic difference was in the original, there was this great moment of horror when they go into the trophy room and they realize what's happening. In this, it's kind of normalized. And this is this thing where basically, rather than it being a visual reveal of what's been happening, it's kind of just a conversation. And then it's like, so people are going to hunt you to death and you're going to get lots of money. Like, oh, okay. So that kind of lost all impact of, and I guess that shows you either how used to that trope we are, that it isn't even an event in a movie to be hunted by someone else, or maybe it's a dark kind of comment on society that they were all hunting each other. I don't know. I don't believe that. So that was a bit of a missed opportunity, I thought. So yeah.
Well, to me, like it's interesting how we went from, like in the original, right? It's Zaroff is not only kind of laying out the rules. He is the hunter, and he's basically like it's his game and stuff like that. Whereas now, like Christoph Waltz plays Miles, who's like this organizer for third parties, and like kind of it's multiple hunters. So I guess it's like maybe like in some ways a commentary about, I don't know, this idea that like we're kind of more removed and detached in some ways of that like we're facilitating psychopaths, I guess, um,
Yeah.
and like kind of maybe in some ways that is like kind of what technology is kind of allowing now. Like we have like the dark web, and we have like like you know more kind of another level like we talked before about pedophiles and stuff like that. That like I guess in some ways technology is kind of like an enabler for these dark desires, and it's like kind of on the one hand it's supposedly anonymous and stuff, but because each of the hunters has this kind of anonymous name and everything, but it's they have to get right up front though too. So that's what's interesting. It's like that. Um, they don't have real names, but you're seeing the real person. Albeit the um, a kind of like I said, cliche characterization and stuff like that. But it's like that they can't use a gun, except for like that if they're killing other people and stuff. So it's kind of I think that's one of the major weaknesses of the thing. It's like kind of besides like the things you mentioned about these different premises and stuff. It's also like kind of these other rules that are kind of like hokey in some ways and stuff.
They change when things get boring in the show, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
always useful plot holes to get out of situations.
I mean, the premise I thought was really cool. Like kind of the idea is like hunting instead of in the jungle and stuff like that. You're in a city, and where then the basic idea of Dodge is that he has to like try to stay safe by hiding with other people, stuff like that. It kind of reminds me. I don't know if you ever played it, but like we in high school somehow we got on this idea of like playing assassination, and the idea is that you would use like a either a squirt gun or a one of those kind of suction cup guns to kind of kill your prey, stuff like that. It's in school, like kind of of course the goal was similarly not to get caught, kind of by the faculty or get kicked out, for kind of and nowadays like probably you probably couldn't really get away with it because the security probably be really concerned if you had even like a plastic what's called gun of any kind of stuff.
Well, we were much less sophisticated. We just called each other names and occasionally got into fights. And that's about it. Yeah, I mean, I think that you picked up on two really interesting things there for me, and that is this idea of like it being based in a city. The interesting thing about the show is that it sort of highlights this idea that if you are homeless or you don't have any resources, then the city is basically like a very brutal place where you have no recourse or there's no place where you can get help really.
We see that when he's stranded without money and stuff.
Absolutely, and the church being one of these few kind of holdout places where you could actually kind of hide out, which of course is a thing that's generally disappearing. The other thing was this idea that you mentioned, the big differences. You have Christoph Waltz as a kind of a middleman, as you say, enabling psychopaths, and this idea that, we are removed. There's these levels of abstraction that allow various sort of moral, offenses, but we're party to it in some degree along the chain. But that's very different from Baron Zaroff, who's basically a complete sort of megalomaniac and makes his own rules, has his own island, and everything is basically about him dominating almost like a god in his kind of area.
This gets into the discussion of then, like, who's the real psychopath and stuff like that. Because here he's a facilitator, and so Miles is this charming kind of just similar charm kind of thing of Zaroff to Zaroff. But meanwhile, I mean, it's almost in some ways to me he's more the monster because he's like facilitating this, going from and like kind of, we won't totally spoil it, but what's called it's set up, kind of that he's going from city to city, kind of, setting up these hunts and everything like that. And that's kind of a horrible, kind of idea in itself that like, there's never mind, kind of these hunters and stuff, but there's these other hunters out there, who are going to, basically hunt some suspecting once he becomes evolved, but otherwise unsuspecting that that somebody's going to end up as the prey and stuff.
Yeah, the sort of grooming prey, basically.
Yeah.
That's the idea. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's one thing to be a mad sort of psycho killer. There's another person to facilitate that and make them even more efficient at killing, which I think is, I guess you can kind of throw some sort of World War II Nazi systems of extermination in there as, some things that are perhaps more horrifying than the act of actually killing someone. But yeah, I mean, I think if we go, one of the things we both listened to before this, if we want to talk about that now, was this podcast between Douglas Rushkoff and Luke Burgess. And this was based on this guy, Girard, who was a professor, I believe. I can't remember if he was a professor, but he has this theory that basically as we learn mimetically, and when we're learning things, learning how to speak, move, everything, we're copying other people.
Right.
And as such, we end up thinking and behaving like lots of other people in various ways. But at some point, a society gets to what's called a mimetic crisis, where too many people are thinking the same way and are too aware of it, and they actively look for a scapegoat, someone who's different from society, with which they can kind of vent this mimetic crisis of similarity. Then the scapegoat is kind of killed, normally in a ritualistic kind of way, and the society gets some kind of relief or transcendence, you might say, out of that previous state, and are able to kind of move and change as a society or as a result. Which was a fascinating podcast. We'll have to put a link into it or something like this. Definitely. But as soon as I mentioned this to John after listening to it, he immediately put this in the framework of, this is to do with psychopaths, because they do ritual killing, and it's often to do with their own personal transcendence, which I thought was really interesting when I went back and listened to it through that kind of lens. And obviously, as we're talking about people that are hunting other people, this seems like as good a time as any to talk about it. So what was your take on the podcast after you listened to it?
Yeah, I found it fascinating too that, like you said, the importance of ritual, because besides the kind of, this crisis of sameness and stuff, it's a fact that, or it's fascinating to me that it requires a ritual, though, kind of like that. And then that was the word that kind of really struck me. And then that's where it really made the connection to, psychopaths and stuff, because a psychopath, regardless of how we think they're crazy or this and that, but they're very organized for the most part. And the ritual is a key part about it, because no matter who, whether it's Ted Bundy or whoever else, they may have different rituals, but they each had their thing about, whether it was horribly or scary enough was maybe collecting, photos, or other times collecting, body parts, or, but it's this ritual of them going through this. And for them, it's, what's fascinating to me is that we have our rituals that's kind of quote unquote healthy, and it's kind of maybe observing kind of in the podcast they talk about the ritual of roast, of when it's somebody like the president or whoever else that a celebrity, and we're kind of roasting them, and they're the scapegoat, and this kind of sacrifice and stuff, and it's ritualized in that there's a certain way that roast is kind of conducted. But for these killers and stuff, that then, their ritual kind of is for them, their outlet and their, kind of connection to, their own kind of, culture of one and stuff like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's what's fascinating.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that. I mean, this is what I got from that, is that basically, like you said, there's a collective ritual that is socially acceptable. And that could be brutal, like it has been in the past, or it could be channeled in a more constructive way, like a roast. But I think for a psychopath, their own transcendence could be part of that ritual, or it could simply be the fact that their separateness from the rest of society is their transcendence. this is they're like, oh, I am singular. I don't have to vent my mimetic crisis in the same way that everyone else does. I will create my own rituals, and that in itself is this kind of transcendent celebration of their own kind of oneness, separateness. And it may be to do with this kind of developmental nature, nurture, mimetic learning. It may be that psychopaths are lacking some part that allows them to empathize and mimetically learn various key things about society and makes them separate in a way.
I mean, you know, as much as like kind of, you know, the let's call it the 2020 you know, version kind of is hokey in some ways and stuff, but it does kind of capture this idea though that, like, you know, here are these hunters and they have their rituals, right, where you know, like the one guy that like you said, it's kind of like a cliche, kind of cartoonish, you know, British kind of hunter, whatever. But he has this kind of ice pick, and so his ritual is the kind of, you know, that he has to kill that way and stuff like that.
Yes.
And you know, it's kind of fascinating that like even at a certain point where like the idea of not doing that was almost like repulsive, or like kind of that, like, you know, couldn't possibly be another way, you know, like kind of, and so it has to be like, for it to be kind of clean almost, that like it has to be done, you know,
in
with
the right
this
way.
Yeah, with that ritual. Yeah,
I mean, Baron Zaroff's the same in that, you know, he has to organize his killing around the framework of a hunt that has a build up and an execution plan. I mean, he could just, when they get stranded on the streets, he could just, on the shore, I should say, he could probably just go up there and just whack them off right there.
right.
But that's not part of the transcendent thing. It's this thing of being the ultimate hunter is part of his ritual.
And I think along with like ritual is this idea of rules though, like, you know, like in both cases, he has to explain the rules, and where that becomes part of the ritual, that like that it has to lay it out as to how, you know, like what's acceptable and stuff. And you know, like I said, there's a lot of exposition in the 2020 remake and stuff, but it's like that is part of the whole, you know, premise of the most dangerous game, is that like in both cases the hunter has to lay out for the prey, you know, like, okay, this is what's, you know, kind of how it's going to go, and this is how, and this is how you fit into kind of the ritual and stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting that any kind of mimetic group that has their own kind of rituals or scapegoats, it doesn't matter how kind of free thinking the philosophy behind that group is. Like, I've been to some sort of very open-minded kind of free sex sort of yoga ashrams in India, but when you go and attend the meditation, the ritual part of it, there are very strict rules. It's like you never go to a ritual where there's sort of, well, not that I've been to a huge amount of rituals, but, or, you know, serial ritual attender. But you know, you don't have a period of people saying, okay, well, we're gonna burn a square over here. You can burn a circle, or just burn a shoe. You know, it's like you don't get rituals where it's a free for except for perhaps Burning Man. I guess that's a kind of that's one where I think is a kind of a slightly more free spirited. But it's definitely, I see that as a modern day ritual that is kind of, you know, channeling something, some sort of crisis of sameness, perhaps.
And you know, as much as like kind of, you know, serial killers, you know, known to be the psychopaths and stuff like that, and they're out on the outside of kind of, you know, normal laws, and, you know, kind of, you know, with that, but both psychopaths and, you know, sociopaths though have this thing for like adherence to rules though. So there's something about that. Yeah, I mean, it's part of the process. It's part of a hard wiring, I guess, in some ways. That you know, like, and you know, even like the series Dexter, we've kind of mentioned before, that like, you know, Dexter has to abide by, you know, Harry's rules and stuff. You know, kind of that provides some kind of structure, I guess. That like, you know, and again, you know, like kind of, I guess that's an interesting connection between, you know, rituals and like and rules and stuff, is that it provides some framework for, you know, how does it all work and stuff.
Well, it provides a framework, and they sort of position it in Dexter as that's what prevents him from going sort of wild and just killing indiscriminately.
Sure.
But by the same token, you could say it's the rules that reinforce the transcendent nature of the killing. So I don't think you would have the transcendence without the rules and the structure, if you see what I mean. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about this conversation was this idea that, you know, entrepreneurs, be them in Silicon Valley, you know, they've written about how, you know, they're trying to, if you're going to be a really successful entrepreneur, you have to differentiate yourself. You have to be like a 10-to-1 sort of maximal person. You have to transcend your competition. And that just immediately made me think, right, this is a kind of a ritual, the ritual of the venture capital ritual. You know, it's like the round alpha B, and then I've transcended when I've sold my company. You know, it's, you know, there's similar mechanics at work here. You know, and Peter Thiel talking about 0 to 1. You're not a 1 unless you've transcended the rest of society.
I think it's similarly to this idea, though, that like it's funny how we went from, you know, during apparently the French Revolution, you know, like kind of the times of you know, the Three Musketeers, or whatever, where we revered kind of conformity and stuff, you know, kind of like you're following a master and stuff like that, and then now we have this worship, or kind of, you know, that we revere, like kind of standing out, which kind of is ironic that on one hand, you know, we have these rituals for kind of conforming, right, and like kind of, you know, mimetic, you know, this mimetic process stuff. But at the same time, what we, you know, kind of really praise and like kind of, you know, single out, right, are these entrepreneurs who rise above. You know, so this is kind of this paradox. On the one hand, you know,
I mean, even the word founder, like they say, it's it has real religious connotations. We revere them. We're like, oh, the Zuckerberg, the Bezos, you know, and they've transcended normality because they're now billionaires. And, you know, it makes me almost start to, because you any kind of religion talks about, you know, oh, love, we'll all transcend all of this and be happy, harmonious. I actually wonder if the whole notion of transcendence is actually fairly damaging. It's like, why can't you just be a normal person? You know, maybe it would just be better if we don't all transcend and become one with the Matrix or whatever kind of, like, you know, half human, half robot thing that's being devised. Is maybe this is all just a bad idea, and we should all just like grow some plants, eat some meat, and just forget about it. You know.
And I think that's the challenge / paradox, though, is that like on the one hand, you know, like kind of, I mean, you know, that is something that like we not only, you know, it's not kind of revered, and maybe we do need to, and I feel like there has been more of a trend in some ways, like, you know, people talking about like kind of, you know, getting back to, and part of the whole COVID thing is like kind of, you know, getting back to what's important, and like kind of, you know, like and you know, valuing like you know, like a day to day that like kind of is normal, like, kind of, and not like, you know, where things are going on a limb or extremes and stuff like that. But on the other hand, I think what's interesting about like kind of, you know, the hero's journey and stuff is about like kind of transcending. It's about like kind of, you know, like facing something like you know, like COVID or a pandemic, and surviving it, and then being transformed in the process and stuff.
I wonder though if this is actually like, I don't know how helpful this is for people to run their lives, because the problem is the hero's journey has some momentous thing where their entire life is changed by the end of it. But most people's lives aren't like that. They're like a sort of steady, sort of slow progression in one direction or another. You know, occasionally there's the odd person who has massive sort of shifts in their life, but you know, I just wonder if people hold on to this moment of like, oh, next year will be my transcendent moment. 5 years down the road will be my transcendent moment. Then that'll be my hero's journey. And actually having that in your mind, actually, perhaps maybe it derails other things that you could have been doing. Perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's the irony. You know, like on the one hand, when you do need to face it, you just have to face it and stuff like that. This
Mm.
something that like kind of confronts you, this kind of challenge and stuff like that. But I think the danger though is like kind of chasing um, something that's going to shake your world. I mean like it's like kind of the people who extreme sports fans, right? That they go out of their way to kind of face something that kind of um, throws them out of their comfort zone, and I think it can get to a point where that can not only be numbing, but it's like kind of like you can become desensitized to it and stuff. And I think that's like kind of sometimes the challenge, like kind of that like maybe for somebody like that, they actually do need to face a little boring boredom, and like that may actually be their transcendence and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, this whole thing of it was really fascinating for me, this idea that a ritual demands a scapegoat. And we seem to have, and we don't have any real religious rituals left in society. We've kind of got rid of all of those. So now there's, as to quote The Day Today, one of my favorite English comedy shows, there's the ritual of the bullying ritual, which is basically, I kind of feel like trolling and cancelling are all just kind of like new
right.
Where we basically we will routinely, our ritual is to go in and we will spread hate in the comments section because it makes us laugh and this is our daily thing. Or we will find the people who are being offensive and we will make sure they get reported and we will cancel them out, and we'll get a lot of people together to make sure we're all kind of feeling the same way. But the problem is there's no real, I don't think that really vents some of the real crisis of the sameness that we might all be. It's not on the same scale. It doesn't apply to our primitive urges as much as, I don't know, say a sacrificial killing or something like that. And so and everything moves so much faster that we're kind of getting into this sort of scapegoating thing on a much more higher frequency. And one thing that came out of that was really interesting for me is that now the victim is now, the alpha victim is now, what rules society. Wherever there is a person who's been victimized, they are the one that everyone must rally around and support. So that's...
I think that's like one thing that I got from the podcast too that was really fascinating was the right wing has kind of made it a thing of like kind of playing the victim, like kind of like I'm the victim and stuff, and it's interesting that kind of like how that's kind of flipped that idea though, that like the rather than being the scapegoat, then it's like kind of that the victim is like kind of this get out of jail card, and it's like, does it kind of really subvert then the whole what should have been an outlet, what should have been kind of a process of like kind of like you said, and a way to kind of even the field a little bit again stuff.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff, definitely. Yeah. So I mean, I guess tying that back to the most dangerous game, you've got kind of definitely the victims are not willing participants in this. There's very much a traditional in the original anyway. In the remake, I guess they kind of complicate that a little more in that Dodge is kind of, he's a victim.
Down on his luck.
Yeah, down on his luck, I suppose. But
I mean, to go back to a little bit the discussions we've had with like kind of about investing and stuff like that. So to me, like like the fact that Dodge kind of has his apartment or this massive building that he's trying to finally make his luck, so to speak, and stuff. And meanwhile, like kind of the wealthy people are the ones that like they're not only taking advantage of his weakness, but like kind of that then the only way for him to get out of it is like kind of to play by their rules for this hunt and risk his life and stuff like that. I guess in some ways, I mean, to me, it really is a metaphor for like kind of what's happened. Like kind of after the real estate crisis, like kind of people's lives have been on the line. Like like, and sure enough, like kind of they literally use like health like as a thing, like where more than one person, like many people have like kind of basically risked their financial / literal life because they couldn't really afford healthcare for some kind of serious treatments and stuff like that. So like I think again, like the premise and like a lot of ideas are really kind of cool in it. Albeit like kind of like a little bit of a hokey execution and stuff like that. But I think they really did put some thought into like kind of what they were going to represent and how like in some ways it represents like kind of this disparity between the 1% and the like the rest of us and stuff who have been kind of trying to dodge not only the real estate crisis, but then now comes this pandemic that again like where the celebrities and other people are kind of living comfortably and like by Uber Eats or whatever else stuff like that. But meanwhile, different people have to like go out into like kind of these jobs that they're putting their lives at risk and stuff like that, and their health to survive.
Yeah, but by whether you say they're comfortably, I mean it's I think what it also shows in this is that the hunters all kind of they have no moment of transcendence. There's no kind of their lives are not improved by this hunt at all. And likewise, I think any kind of existential crisis plagues billionaires just as it does normal people. They just look for it in more bizarre ways, but ultimately it's a kind of like I've now come to this my anti-transcendence kind of ideal. I think both are just a fool's errand in a way.
Yeah, I mean that is the other irony too, right? That like it's a hollow ritual that like isn't going to offer really any transcendence for either, other than like I guess like if the prey is kind of fortunate enough to survive and stuff, then I guess the transcendence is to kind of to financially kind of escape things and stuff. But I think this is definitely something in the movie and in real life. Like we're not likely to see like somebody who's like kind of has to work during the pandemic and kind of risk their life and limb. They're lucky just to continue to get by. They're not going to have some kind of massive payday that they, escape out of their situation and stuff.
Yeah, there's been a lot of stuff in COVID that I've just kind of thrown up my arms and wondered. I mean, in England there was a thing where clapping for carers, where everyone would go outdoors at 6 o'clock and clap for all these people who are risking their lives, and like that. That's great and everything, but why not just pay them more money, as this is a really dire need for society right now? No, we'll clap. Thank God. But anyway, so I mean it's better than nothing, I guess, but it's depressing at the same time. But I think we'll see. I mean, I think GameStop and Wall Street bets will be in a transcendent moment for some people in terms of this ability to kind of rework the system in their favor. And I think we'll see more of that. If I had to make one prediction though about the future, is that I think we will see a lot more rituals. I think you will find artificial rituals spinning up. I think we'll end up with a kind of a non-traditional, but it will seem strange to us now, but not so much, I guess, in the future, where faith ritual makes a much bigger part of our everyday lives. That just seems very alien now, so it's almost certainly going to happen. That's the way I kind of see it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, coming up, we'll in a couple of weeks kind of look at some more unofficial remakes, as mentioned, of The Most Dangerous Game. Next week, just to kind of in some ways commemorate the anniversary of like kind of the Battle Midway, we'll look at the two movies that have been made about that. Looking much more forward, Dan and I both looking forward to talk about The Handmaid's Tale, and that's kind of been really just a series that's kind of taken off as we've been discussing offline, and throwing in there, I think the other thing was Valley Girl, which is kind of a one-off for us, but I think it'll be interesting kind of looking at some different revisiting the 80s and that kind of idea. So once again, I'm John Cheng with Dan Edmonds. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.